Kupiansk, Russia.
Kupiansk, Russia. In the last few hours, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a counter-offensive in Kupiansk with the goal of creating an escape route for the Ukrainian soldiers trapped in the region. The counter-offensive turned out to be a complete disaster. The Russian armed forces responded by eliminating the Ukrainian units and, in the process, captured the last contested territories of Kupiansk. Kupiansk, Russia. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 286 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. On the other side of the screen, we're joined by Mr. Fernando Moragón from Madrid, Spain. Fernando, how are things over there?
Well,
it's raining here. And when it rains in Madrid, especially not so much elsewhere, but in Madrid, people don't know how to drive. We Madrilenians don't know how to drive in the rain. So you get these ridiculous traffic jams, right? Like, for example, when you take the road to get onto the M30, which is an inner ring road in Madrid, right? You take the lane to merge, and there's this huge line of cars, and you think, wow, this is a terrible delay. But no, then you see there aren't even that many cars on the M30. What happens is that since people don't know how to drive, they're afraid to merge, they go really slowly, and they merge in a pathetic way. I'm sorry, but I know I'm going to get flack from all sides for saying this. But we Madrilenians don't know how to drive. We don't know how to drive. I mean, we follow the rules, sure, but we have zero skill. Absolutely none. I don't know about other places since I haven't driven enough, but... And speaking of the rain, which we're not used to here, what's really pouring down, and a lot, is not exactly water, though that too, but bombs. And that's happening over there in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian front. The Ukrainians are terrified. There's more and more talk of internal disputes and a possible coup, soft or hard, we'll see, to get Zelensky out of the way. The Europeans are panicking, they don't know what to do, and Trump is quite happy with other things. That is to say, whether Venezuela yes, Venezuela no, and all those things we've already gotten used to.
How are you, Fernando? Yes, to begin the analysis of the situation on the battlefield, we first present the images released by the Russian armed forces of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kupiansk, announced by Zelensky, with the goal, once again, of creating an exit for the Ukrainian soldiers trapped in the region. One curious thing about Zelensky: on one hand, he denies the encirclement, and on the other, he orders operations to create an exit for the soldiers from the encirclement. But well, contradictions of the Ukrainian leader, the Ukrainian president whose term has expired. These are the images released just minutes ago by the Russians. The counteroffensive. Well there, yes, this time without music, with soldiers and armored vehicles, all of them eliminated. Several units were involved in this liberation operation, different from the last one, right? That one was an airborne operation with helicopters. And here, these people clearly wanted something of a larger scale, but faced with encirclement, no results. These are the images released. On the other hand, Fernando, here we also see footage of civilians leaving Kupiansk. In some areas still adjacent to the city, still under Ukrainian control, apparently out of fear that the retreating Ukrainian troops might carry out massacres, as they have so many times before, against those still present.
Indeed, I mean, what I think is really admirable is the people who, well, I understand if you're living in a city, you have your home there, your job, your life and all that, your family, etc. It's really hard to leave. But I'm one of those who, if I were on the front line, or directly at the front like in Kupiansk, I'd be one of those who would leave. I mean, well, to hell with the house and everything else. The main thing is to save your life. And I wouldn't stay in a city where fighting is going on. Then, of course, once things are over and all that, yes, I'd go back. But I find it really, well, incredible, that people hold out there, as I said, in a combat zone like Kupiansk.
Ya digo, en una zona de combate, como es Kupiansk. Es decir, no estamos hablando de que, bueno, te puede caer alguna bomba porque...
That is, we're not talking about, well, you might get hit by a bomb because you're near where the fighting is happening. No, you're actually where the fighting is happening. So, well, let's see. In fact, most of the population in most of the cities where these things happen leaves. We've seen cities, but especially towns, where there's no one left. They've gone. That is, in the famous Robotyne, for example, from the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, which was a small village, there was no one there. Everyone left, logically, because, let's remember, they were attacking, counterattacking, capturing 3 houses here, then a few more, then the Russians counterattacked and recaptured them. Well, this, of course, is really impressive. These people have incredible endurance. They're made of something else, both Ukrainians and Russians. Just imagine, Ezekiel, if we had to do or endure something like that in Western Europe. Germans, Spaniards, French, no way. There'd be a stampede here, every man for himself, worse than the Titanic. Everyone would be running, and that's that. However, these people have, I don't know, maybe because of their history or culture, an ability to suffer and to endure misfortune, like a war that has been lost in the West. That no longer exists.
Por aquí, Fernando, a propósito de...
Over here, Fernando, regarding the terrible situation of these people, we have footage showing civilians leaving the region. I won't show it in full because of how horrific it is, but I will show a portion as evidence of the barbarity of this war, and above all, of the Ukrainian armed forces, who have been ordered to destroy everything as they retreat. This footage was captured by a Russian drone at the moment when 2 civilians carrying a white flag were leaving. One of them, an adult accompanied by a small dog, and the other, an elderly man. They were leaving the area, clearly out of fear of massacres. A Ukrainian drone was following them below, and at a certain point, the officer in charge apparently gave the order to eliminate these people, resulting in their killing. There you can see the man with the little dog.
There's the drone in front.
The drone in front until, well, up to here, because the images are horrible. Up to here, and this is the other one, the other image, over there. To make matters worse, well, the 2 people died immediately, but the poor little dog was half dead. It was, well, yes, destroyed on the ground with one little paw, poor thing, trembling, until after a while the dog also died. Horrible images, we're not showing them in full precisely for that reason. But to me, this is part of our job. Fernando, even though it's unpleasant, we're not showing it for sensationalism or anything like that. That's why we're not showing the harshest parts. There are the people, the older man in the back, in front an adult, a grown person, and the little dog accompanying them. There's the drone, visible.
Yes, perfectly.
And the little dog behind them, until the Ukrainian drone operator decides. You can see it there, you can see how it moves. The men advance with a white flag, as if saying, we just want to get out. Well, there's the little dog, We haven't shown anything. The 2 people were eliminated with drone strikes directly to their heads. Nothing more, nothing less. This is the deadly precision of these devices. Yes, look.
We've been able to see the size of the drone. It was a very tiny drone. That is, these FPV drones used for attacks and such have a variable range, but let's say that along the front line they can reach up to 30 kilometers deep on either side. Well, with these drones, it's clear that anyone who tries to move, whether civilian or military, in that area is detected and tracked by a drone.
Detectado, seguido por un dron. Es decir, ahora mismo
I mean, right now, well, the image you showed, the one you put up of, I don't know if you still have it around from Pro Crops, where you can see a bunch of drones and it looks like a hornet's nest. But a hornet's nest made of drones. It's impossible to get through because you've got a ton of drones that will detect even the slightest movement. Here you can see the cruelty of war, as you rightly point out. I mean, you can't sugarcoat war. So, well, there we can see it. Look, check it out, 1, 2, 3 over here. But now more are coming out. I mean, another one over here and so on. Now more are coming out up above, another one back there. Look, yes, 7. Now others are coming through the smoke. Impossible. I mean it.
Imposible, quiero decir. Esto es de Procrops de la semana pasada. Imposible.
This is from Pro Crops, from last week. It's impossible. Look, passing through here, there's another one up there, almost at the corner. Well, it's like this all along the front line, and especially in the areas where the fighting is heaviest. So the small bottleneck that remains in Pro Crops is suicidal. Even at night, taking advantage of fog or whatever, it's just impossible. I mean, with this density of drones, let's say per square meter, it's impossible. And this is modern warfare. This has caused, mind you, things we started seeing at the beginning of the special military operation in 2022. Things that were widely used, such as tanks, self-propelled artillery, but also, and most importantly, all kinds of armored combat vehicles, to, in a certain sense, fall out of use. Why? Because, of course, as we've seen with the destruction of the vehicles that were in Kupiansk, they're very easy to detect, very slow, and even if they're armored, they'll end up being destroyed, because 1, 2, 3 drones attack them and eventually disable them. In fact, what we're seeing is that both Russians and Ukrainians, in assault units, no longer use the famous motorcycles or buggies. They actually prefer to use cars, as I like to say, Mad Max style. Meaning like in the movie, ordinary cars that they modify, add some grills and such, remove the doors. And they do this, among other reasons, so that, as we've seen many times, if a drone heads toward the car, they can get out quickly.
Ellos pueden salir rápidamente. No tenga que estar abriendo una puerta ni nada por el estilo. Bueno, pues estamos cada vez viendo más cosas.
They don't have to open a door or anything like that. Well, we're seeing more and more of these things because they're more flexible, they can move better on the roads, avoid drones, cars are faster than armored vehicles. In other words, a complete transformation of warfare. And as I was saying, what we're seeing here, well, and there's something important to mention about civilians, which I almost forgot. Sometimes armies do something terrible, which is to use civilians to slow down the enemy's advance. That is to say, if I have a city full of civilians, and on top of that, I hide, for example, my artillery next to hospitals, schools, buildings, apartments, then if the other side, as happens with the Russians, feels some shame and doesn't want to attack those, that makes my defensive task easier. In other words, using civilians as hostages, as people usually say, or as human shields to defend my positions. So if the civilians leave, as in the case we've seen, you're left without a human shield. That's why these atrocities are committed to prevent civilians from leaving, because it allows for a better defense. I know this is barbaric, but it happens. That's just how things are.
How about we go along the line of contact, dear Fernando? Well, maybe all the way up north, because...
Yes, this is important because we can see there that on the border between Russia and Ukraine, where a small advance took place months ago, well, in recent times progress has continued, and now we have a connection between that line and all of this is in Kharkiv. There we have it. And what we see in gray is already in Russian hands. In other words, a small pocket or a mini pocket was created, which the Russians are conquering quickly and have practically closed already. So we can see that what started as a small advance to take a locality has indeed expanded, and has now joined the part of Kharkiv that the Russians already held. If we continue south, we'll reach Gutian, but this is already starting to move forward. That is to say, it's no longer just a small position, but a full-scale advance that for now continues. In recent days, we've seen progress toward the city or region of Dvorchanske, and several villages have already been taken. And mind you, these are the kind of places where at first it seems like things won't escalate. But since you have to send troops and pull them from other areas to deploy them to the places that are currently more dangerous and more concerning for the Ukrainian army, like Prokropsk, Kupiansk, Konstantinivka, and so on, you end up withdrawing them from here or from Sumy and so on. And then, at first glance, this really reactivates the front and makes that part advance spectacularly, always keeping in mind that we're in a war of positions. Careful, this is something we need to keep in mind. Let it stick in our heads, because it could have quite an impact. Maybe not right now, not this week or the next, but little by little, as I said, they're creating this area of advance, and the Ukrainians are going to have to react at some point. But the Ukrainians' problem, as we've seen, is that they don't have enough troops, they don't have enough people. There's already pressure, talk of a total general mobilization, including women, basically anyone who can be mobilized, anyone with almost 2 legs, who isn't elderly or a child. And that's because there's no way to stop the Russians, who, for example, according to Ukrainian sources, in Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians themselves were saying that the Russians had an 8-to-1 superiority.
A question about this quadrant, this triangle. This corner isn't that small. Territorially, it's huge, but it lacks major cities, lacks strategic relevance. All this... My cursor didn't follow me. All this area here, a lot of land, basically fields and plains. Now then, my question is the following. Once the capture of Pokrovsk and Kupiansk is completed, Russia will undoubtedly carry out a deep operation toward this area. How massive it will be, well, we can't determine that. But without a doubt, after Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, Russia will begin an advance against the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk axis on one side, with the last defensive fortifications, and on the other side, certainly through here as well. The question, Fernando, is, if the Ukrainians have to respond with insufficient troops to defend against both Russian offensives, this one here on one side and the Bolchansk one on the other, what would happen?
No, and the one from Bolchansk.
This is important, Bolchansk, and the one from Bolchansk down below as well.
Up north. I mean, where is it going?
Of course. We don't believe Bolchansk is about to be taken. Up there in the north, there in Bolchansk, it's about to be taken. And from there, they're going to advance. Look, you can see that there could be an advance from 2 positions where the Ukrainians don't have enough men to face Bolchansk. And at the same time, this area, let's say Odratne, or whatever we want to call it, because it's one of the villages they have, that is, look at the possible convergence.
Well, then the question is as follows. The advance, then. Yes, Fernando, the question is this. Are they going to respond with those insufficient troops to this northern offensive? With no major cities in sight, no strategic objectives, but with the possibility of very deep advances over flat fields, and therefore very contrary to the Western media narrative that in all these 3 years they've barely conquered 20 or 25% of the territory. Well, here, suddenly, they might be able to conquer a lot of territory in something more like a positional war. Either the Ukrainians will respond to the offensive along the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk axis, which covers far fewer kilometers, but is strategically much more important because of the cities that have been entrenched and fortified over the past few years. And these are the last defensive positions of Donetsk. In your opinion, if you were Zelensky, how would you respond? With the military logic of defending Sloviansk-Kramatorsk, or with the media logic of defending these areas that have no military sense whatsoever? Fernando.
Let's see, we already know that what Zelensky wants is publicity. So he's going to choose the scenario that gives him the most publicity. He's not going to use military criteria. We've seen it in Prokhorovka right now. We're seeing it in Kupiansk, that is. Denying reality, saying, no, well, they're still saying that Prokhorovka hasn't been taken by the Russians. In other words, they're still, well, imagining things, to put it mildly. So, well, it will depend a lot on that, on whether we imagine that there's a significant advance here. And there's one thing we don't know. Besides the fact that there's a hub here called, I always pronounce it terribly, Praikolotne, which is a road junction, as you can see, and an important one, this would recover part of Kharkiv. They might even reach Ryodonsk. And let's not forget that Kharkiv on the map, the second most important city in Ukraine, isn't too far away. That is, if there's a major advance here, they would start putting Kharkiv and everything supplied from the north through many roads in trouble. That is, all the logistics going to Kupiansk, well, that's already been cut off, but the ones going further south, even reaching the Izium regions and so on. In other words, be careful, because a major advance here would force the Ukrainians to deploy a large number of troops to stop the Russians. We'll see. That is, the Russians here will always proceed very cautiously, let's say, in their dance with the Ukrainians. In the sense that where you move, where you currently have more troops concentrated, there I won't advance much, I'll just hold you. But where you have fewer, I'll take advantage and move forward. And how are you going to try to stop me when you see that I'm advancing in that sector where you have few troops? Then you'll move troops again. That is, you'll pull troops, since you already have reserves. You'll pull troops from other places, and then I'll see where you've taken troops from so I can take advantage of it and move forward. This will become more and more noticeable, this strategy of death by 1,000 cuts that we've talked about many times. And of course, if there's a major advance here, if, for example, the Bolshansk front joins with this corner front, which could be called Dobryshansky, well, watch out, they'd have to take action. That's why I say everything will depend on the situation. The Russians are not in a hurry. They know they're going to win, they're doing their job, and they're not going to speed things up just to finish a bit earlier. Because let's not forget, what the Russians prioritize, unlike the Ukrainians, is minimizing the loss of Russian soldiers. It doesn't matter if they move fast or slow, or if they attack in one sector or another. The priority is to lose as few soldiers, as few troops as possible. Meanwhile, as we're seeing, the Ukrainians are sacrificing troops in absolutely foolish ways, as they're doing again in Pokrovsk or in Kupiansk. That is, launching senseless counterattacks and failing to withdraw in time. This is one of those things the Ukrainians are doing from a military point of view in Kupiansk. In that pocket, they're stuck in. Why didn't they pull out earlier? That's hard to understand. You set up a defensive line somewhere else, further back, deeper in your own sector, one that's more solid and can stop the Russians. That's the idea. What the Ukrainian army hasn't understood, and I think it's a mistake, and therefore NATO, which we shouldn't forget, is the one calling the shots here, is that the Ukrainian army, in its current condition, and even more so as the war has gone on over these years, if it wants to maintain the ability to hold back the Russians, it shouldn't be focusing on counterattacks, let alone launching offensives. What they need to do is mount a solid defense that makes it extremely costly for the Russians, in manpower, vehicles, in every way, to advance. But holding on in these pockets, as you rightly point out, holding on in these encirclements, in a stubborn, last-stand fashion, just to prevent the news from reporting, to keep it from appearing in Western or Ukrainian media that Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, or this pocket has fallen. Well, in fact, there are already internal criticisms, even from military figures, and public ones at that, appearing on television channels saying,
Ukrainian analysts, or the more serious pro-Ukrainian analysts, respond to this by saying that, indeed, from a military standpoint, it would make sense to pull back and establish more stable, stronger defensive positions. For example, to abandon this area and create a line that even takes advantage of a geographical feature, in this case, a dam. But they respond at the same time. Since Ukraine, in reality, lacks its own armed forces, and the Ukrainian military effort depends on the supply of Western weapons, Ukraine must also make decisions based on the need to generate, for those suppliers of weapons and money, news that justifies the continuation of the war. And that's why they sometimes decide on things like this, simply to avoid creating bad news that might, in some way, delay the delivery of money and weapons. That's their reasoning. To me, it doesn't make sense, given the situation. But well, that's the most logical explanation from their side.
Every time Zelensky meets with Trump, there can't be any bad news. So he has to do whatever it takes, even if he loses a lot of men. But there can't be bad news, and this position, this territory, can't be lost until after the interview with Trump. We've seen this many times. Well, let's remember. Let's go. Let's go.
There's the bag, or actually the two bags now. Yes, the bag split in two. Worse.
Worse. I mean, you can clearly see there an incoming, let's say, red area that's splitting the pocket in two. And let's not forget that the big problem is that Kupiansk is practically taken. The western part is occupied. Remember, there's a river in the middle, which is the larger part of the city, and then the eastern part is falling. They've already crossed the river, and the Russians are advancing. In other words, Kupiansk is finished. It makes no sense to try counterattacks to retake Kupiansk. They can't. They also have the river, yes, which is key, the Oskil River. There are no bridges left, meaning they're basically trying to set up pontoon bridges, but they don't last long because the Russians bomb them. So of course, if on top of that we have in Pishchan, I always say this is terrible, but well, Pishchan, that is, we have this line, this penetration that's going to split this pocket in two. And as I said, they have the river at their backs. Let's not forget that having a river behind you is crucial because you have to cross it. It's a natural barrier that in this case serves as an encirclement, not as a defense. So it makes no sense at all to hold this position, where you no longer even have Petropavlivka, which had been an important defensive area but has been lost. This area of the Oskil River, well, it's not a big deal. In other words, you pull back and preserve what for you is the main issue, which is your troops. When you're short on soldiers, you try to keep as many as possible and move, indeed, to a rear area where you can establish yourself solidly. That's what the Russians ultimately did here in Kharkiv. Let's not forget that in 2022, when there was a Ukrainian offensive across that whole sector in Kharkiv, where the Russians barely had any units, and they were mostly territorial forces, Interior Ministry troops, very few of them, facing the harsh Ukrainian advance, the Russians lost their support, the Ukrainians even pushed further. But what the Russians did was look for a line where they could stabilize the front. What did they do?
Fernando, the retreat.
Claro, efectivamente, un repliegue
Of course, exactly. A withdrawal that is already considered by all experts and analysts as, let's say, textbook, exemplary, because it was carried out in such a way that not a single soldier was lost. In other words, General Surovikin indeed executed a fantastic withdrawal. Well, why? Because they clearly saw that it made no sense, moreover, for elite troops like the paratroopers to be stationed in Kherson, sacrificing troops to defend a territory that contributes nothing at the moment. That is to say, well,
just for context, as a reminder for the viewers, because we remember very specific things. In Kherson, Russia, at the beginning of its offensive, had captured the capital of Kherson, located on the other side of the Dnipro River. That was the main city taken by the Russians, one of the oblast capitals, with a considerable population. And later, when they began to retreat as a result of Ukraine's successful counteroffensive, the one in 2022, not the other disastrous one, that city was left on the other side of the Dnipro River, Russia had to shorten its lines, and Putin decided to change I don't remember which general was in charge. Surovikin? No, the one before him. I don't remember the previous one. Ah, right. Yes, he changes. Change of general.
Vale, sí, cambia de general.
Surovikin makes a difficult but militarily logical decision to abandon that bridgehead in the most important city taken by Russia in order to create a barrier with the river and thus greatly shorten the lines and focus on the rest of the battlefield. He was blasted in the Western media, criticized. Russia abandons Kherson. What a disaster. But they didn't suffer a single casualty. It was a planned withdrawal. From that point on, a shift begins in the course of the war. Because Russia undertakes a war of attrition policy with that entire part of the front secured, thanks to that difficult decision, criticized by the Western media, but militarily brilliant. Well, that's something Ukraine obviously can't do, Fernando, that kind of decision in these pockets.
But those are logical decisions, meaning that when you face situations where it no longer makes sense to defend certain territories or positions that have become indefensible, what you do is pull back. What did they do? A withdrawal to the other side of the river. Notice that the Russians, also Kherson was taken on the first day of the special military operation, because that area fell almost, well, without a fight. Unlike other places where the situation was very tough and very difficult for the Russians, there specifically it fell without a fight. And in fact, in a short time, they advanced up to Mykolaiv and almost surrounded it. That is, they semi-encircled it. Then the Ukrainian counterattacks led to the abandonment of that encirclement of Nikolaev. They continued through Kherson, cutting down the area the Russians had conquered, and in the end what they had left they abandoned, because it made no sense. That is, on the other side of a river like the Dnieper, they have many more options, as was seen, to mount a defense, in addition to deploying large numbers of troops. And there we also saw another one of NATO's foolish moves. After all, ultimately it was NATO that gave the green light to the offensives, the attacks, and so on. That is, from NATO, and therefore from the Ukrainians, who tried to assault several islands in the Dnieper and establish a bridgehead on the other side, losing men senselessly, sending troops and more troops to be crushed by artillery, by bombs, for nothing.
Let's see, what's the point of this pyramid? The town called Kringy, do you remember it? Kringy, yes. Tiny, with weekend houses, yes.
Yes, well, for a tiny bridgehead that's useless, because you say, okay, I can attack, establish a bridgehead, even if it costs me a lot of casualties, because, well, breaking through a line always costs casualties in general. But if I have reserves behind that can make that breakthrough in one part of the front expand, because I can keep sending in troops and rotating those on the front line, fine, that makes sense. But if you don't have enough troops to then exploit that advance you've made in a certain position, that breakthrough in the front, then it makes no sense. It's losing men just for the sake of losing them.
Pues no tiene sentido. Es perder hombres por perderlos.
The
number of videos shown here of boats with Ukrainians being hit by drones at the moment of landing. At one point, I remember that in those swampy areas they could barely move through them because of the number of bodies piled up from previous failed landings. A ghastly thing, utterly senseless. Terrible. Fernando, what's going on with Surovikin?
Well, Surovikin was removed from his position. It had an influence that Surovikin had a very good relationship with someone we all know, who was the head of the Wagner group.
A man who had an accident on a plane, right?
Yes, exactly. So he had a very good relationship. Let's say he was in line with him. And of course they got him out of the way, sent him to Africa. He's been there for quite some time, I'm not sure right now. But he may still be playing different roles in Africa. Let's remember that in Africa, the Wagner group was mainly active in different countries. Wagner has ceased to exist, and what was in Africa has been restructured into what is now called the African Corps. But basically they're Wagner members turned into regular army soldiers.
Reconvertidos en soldados del ejército regular, digamos.
Fernando's reference to Prigozhin, Wagner's leader at the time, founder and head of the group, later at odds with the Russian government, and well, actually first with an apology and a second chance, went back to his old ways and finally, well, a plane crash. Now Fernando, a question about Surovikin. What now, right? Thinking it over, if I were Maduro, if I were Venezuelan, I would have called Surovikin one of the best examples of military strategy in the world, not only responsible for that withdrawal in Kherson, but also the mastermind behind the Surovikin line. I would have called him. If they didn't actually determine Surovikin's death because of his military genius, otherwise they would have already gotten rid of him. So better placed somewhere else, and that's it. If I were in Maduro's position, I would have called Surovikin a year or two ago. As soon as they removed him from there, and even more so now, with the US threat. I would have appointed him as Commander-in-Chief of Venezuela's defenses, or as a strategist to create a defensive line against the United States, if he truly was a military genius.
Well, sure, but he's still an active Russian general. I mean, it's one thing for them to send him somewhere else, and another to send him to Africa.
But in Venezuela?
Yeah, but Putin would have to give permission and say, well, graduate with honors, let's say, or move to the reserves, and then you can go, right? But it has to be with his permission.
Fernando, imagine an invasion in Venezuela, and suddenly, while waiting for the US Marines, a Surovikin line built by himself, but with Venezuelan soldiers, with the same effectiveness as the Surovikin line against Ukraine. It would be a bloodbath.
Let's see, I think, look at what I'm telling you. I mean, I don't really know Venezuela's geography well enough to see what options there are, but, well, I think you never know. With the United States, they do the most absurd things, so you never know. But in principle, I think that no one with a minimum of judgment in the United States, in the Pentagon, among Trump's advisors, is going to say, all right, let's invade Venezuela, occupy it, and then we'll see what to do next. Then we'll put Corina Machado, Guaido, or whoever. I don't think that would even cross anyone's mind, because it would be a disaster for the United States. That is to say, since this hasn't worked in Iraq or Afghanistan, I think they've learned a little from that. The whole invading and occupying thing, not so much. I mean, nowhere. The options, I think, right now are different. One, the toughest from a military standpoint, but there Venezuela would have a hard time defending itself because it would mean attacking military and strategic centers and so on. And they're going to do this from a great distance. Let's remember the famous tomahawks, which can be launched from 1,600 kilometers away. In that case, Venezuelan defenses wouldn't stand a chance. Because while they've now sent the Russians some bread, yes, and whatever, I don't know, they don't have, let's say, a complete layered defense system. That is, the Russians have a defensive system that ranges from systems to destroy missiles, aircraft, and so on, at short, medium, and long range. And for that, they have different systems that work in layers and attack whatever comes at them from different distances, so to speak. And Venezuela doesn't have that. So I think that they might even come up with an operation to take out Maduro, President Maduro. It's possible.
I think what they're going to try. I agree with everything. Now, with an asset like Surovikin, and here, by the way, a very smart comment about the different characteristics of the Venezuelan armed forces, the different characteristics of the territory, I agree with everything. Now, if Surovikin is available, this is like Messi being a free agent. I'd call him anyway, Fernando. But well, that's already a bit of a fantasy. No, but there you have it. The person who wrote this is absolutely right.
Obviously, Venezuela has nothing to do with the situations in Ukraine or Russia. We're in a tropical zone, and so on. They have that advantage, meaning the advantage of having the Orinoco jungles, etc., around the Orinoco, where it's very difficult for an attacker to attack, for example, a guerrilla system that will wear you down. They also say something interesting here.
A question from Tito Rodriguez, who joined us at the meeting with Demolidores here in Buenos Aires. This is, by the way, our last broadcast from Buenos Aires. Next Friday will be with Juan Antonio Aguilar from Berlin again. Great talk in Buenos Aires. Question: after the Russians reach the Dnieper, what will they do? As Daniel Stulin says, Russia today lacks the ideological framework to justify its actions. They're only fighting for their security. Interesting question. We're moving away from the topic of the front. Well, let's see. We'll do okay. But we'll answer it, otherwise we'll answer it quickly. Yes.
Let's see. An ideology is being created in Russia. There's already a foundation. We'll see how it turns out. But obviously it has nationalist components, like all kinds of modern ideologies. In addition, an idea of culture is being developed that goes beyond Russian civilization. I'm not very convinced by this, but they're working on it with some distinctive historical elements that would make Russia neither Europe nor Asia, but something different. Well, we'll see how far this idea goes, right? But as I said, there is a Russian nationalism. There always has been, and it's being strengthened. The Orthodox Church is also a distinctive element, even though there are other religions. Well, there's the idea of a Siberian Russia, meaning that the true Russian would be the Siberian Russian, as opposed to the European Russian. There are a lot of things emerging, as Karaganov and others have said. Anyway, we'll see. They're working on it, and whether something comes out of it that really takes hold among the population and confirms a new Russian social identity. That's something time will tell.
For me, much more important than the conquest of additional territories. Once all the territories up to the Dnieper River have been taken, which is no simple task, are other priorities. For Putin and for Russia, these seem to be non-territorial issues, tied to many other geopolitical matters. Not only security regarding their western flank, Eastern Europe, but also their relationship with China, the situation in Iran, relations with the United States, and the nuclear issue, about which we're going to present something. So there's still quite a way to go on other matters. How about we introduce, dear Fernando, Ezequiel Bistoletti. He's ready, right?
Bueno, tenemos, si bajamos más hacia el sur,
Well, we have it, and we're moving further south. Very important, we're seeing progress practically every day in the Lyman sector, let's say, which is the key area, because in other places there's less progress. That is, for example, here in the Luhansk area in yellow, well, they're in red and so on. Well, but it's just that I have another map and I'm looking at it here. That's why. Let's see. It's not exactly the same, but, well, the colors are different.
Pero bueno, los colores son distintos. Bueno, a ver, en la zona de Liman, que es fundamental.
Well, let's see. In the Liman area, which is crucial, they're advancing. There are some positions here, but the rest is open field. That is like Stavki, which is a small settlement they've practically taken up there. Indeed, that kind of tip we see to the north, well, this is key. They're going to finish taking it quickly. And as you can see, toward Liman, there are hardly any settlements left, meaning there are some fortifications and so on. In fact, they've already entered Lyman. I mean, fighting is already taking place in Liman, in that southern part of the city, which is strategic. Important, the roads are cut off.
Que es estratégica, importante, las carreteras están cortadas, es decir, la carretera que une esta.
That is, the road that connects this place with Yaroba and so on is cut off. Here we can see there's an advance through the forested area. This dark area is a forest zone. What we see there in dark yellow are forests. They're advancing, and those connections have already been severed. Right now, Lyman is in a tough spot because it only has one road left that goes from Sloviansk and crosses the Donets River. The rest, complicated. Important, taking Lyman is absolutely necessary in order to then go for Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So as I'm going to show here, this is key. Given what we're seeing, one can always be wrong, but, well, I think Lyman could fall in January. Of course, this depends on many factors, right?
A ver, todo depende de muchos factores, ¿no? Y de prioridades del ejército ruso.
And about the priorities of the Russian army, and about the counterattacks the Ukrainians might launch. But I think Lyman could easily fall by January. It could even fall earlier. It depends on many factors. And then there's another one that's on its last legs, Siversk, which is a smaller city that, since the road connecting Lyman and Siversk has been cut off, practically has no, well, not practically. It has no supplies, meaning no secondary roads or anything like that.
Y carreteras secundarias y cosas de estas. Y si veis, Siversk está ahí rodeada más al sur.
And if you look, Siversk is there surrounded. Further south, Siversk is completely encircled. From the north, from the east, and from the south. In fact, the latest I've been able to see is that they keep advancing from the south towards Zvanivka. Fighting is already taking place in Zvanivka. The Russians already control the southern part of that town. They're going to end up closing this gap here. They keep advancing there. And they've already entered from the south. In that strip you can see, they've already entered Siversk from the south. I think Siversk is going to fall relatively quickly because it's a city that's hard to defend, since it's, let's say, in a low-lying area.
Porque está, digamos, en una parte baja, y los atacantes vienen de partes altas, con lo cual eso facilita.
And the attackers are coming from higher ground, which makes the attack easier, especially from the north and the east. And as you can see, practically the moment they fill this in, and they're already doing it, right? They'll have the city almost in a semicircle, with very few possibilities to supply it logistically. As we always say, logistics is key. That is, in the end, for example, a withdrawal, when we talked about Kupiansk, a withdrawal in Kupiansk, a gap, a position. Again, you say, well, I lose territory, but that benefits my logistics. Why? Because I have to cover less ground, less territory.
Que recorrer menos terreno, menos territorio. Porque me he ido hacia atrás.
Because I've moved back, I've retreated and made the attackers' logistics more difficult, in this case the Russians, who have to advance and often rebuild roads that are destroyed, communication centers, railways. Let's not forget that the train is key. Well, rebuilding tracks and all that takes them time. What's going to happen in Pokrovsk? Pokrovsk is now going to become a logistical hub for the Russians. But they're not going to do this in a single day. That is, they have to rebuild all those elements so it can become that logistical node that allows their advance. So time must be gained.
que permita el avance. Bueno, pues es ganar tiempo. Es decir, y aquí en Sibersk lo tienen muy crudo, las cosas como son.
And here, in cyber, they've got it really tough. Let's be honest, you just have to look at the difficulties the Ukrainians are facing and how once the southern advance finishes with this small town, Zabanivka, and they also reach along this road, or maybe it's a railway line, I'm not sure, in any case a road, up to here, to Siverts from the south, they'll move into Asako to take the city. As I said, it's a smaller city than Liman and hard to defend, so I think this will fall before the end of the year, almost for sure.
Antes de que finalice el año, casi con seguridad. Pero veremos.
But we'll see, because as you pointed out earlier, Zelensky's political criteria make them move from one place to another based on publicity considerations. Let's say on how to advertise to Westerners that he's winning, even if it's not true, or that the Russians are advancing more slowly or not taking this or that city. These are criteria that, since they're not military, depend on a bunch of random factors. So, well, maybe they'll say, all right, now I'll launch a counterattack to try to keep this from falling. Well, but anyway, to begin with, Siver was extremely difficult to hold. And this is fundamental because one of the major problems the Russians have had in this sector is that there was a sort of salient from the Ukrainians that reached all the way to Vilovica, and it cost the Russians an enormous effort to take it. And this is what they've been eliminating. And from now on, what they'll be able to do is align the front. This is important because if you have a front, as we see here with many curves, it forces you to deploy more units. In other words, you end up with a longer front line, and that complicates everything. So aligning the front, making it straighter, is essential. Exactly, you pointed out perfectly here. This is key, and will allow them to advance much more easily once they've taken Siversk towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the east. And, well, what we'll start seeing next year, actually, is that these advances will begin to encircle Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the north, the east, and the south. That is to say, and crucially, and we'll assess this in future programs, that possible movement from Popasna through the rear to complete the encirclement of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. But anyway, we'll get to that. Here we have, look, you can see it clearly in red. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are almost touching. The distance between them is minimal.
La distancia entre una otra es testimonial. Bueno, pues estas ciudades que ya son grandes, estas son más grandes que Lima.
Well, these cities, which are already large, larger than Lyman, of course, much larger than Siversk, had a significant population. So as we can see, they're going to be attacked from the east once Lyman is taken, from the north, and then there's a move they can make from Popasna, which would be from the rear, advancing to complete the encirclement, mainly to cut off the logistics of these two cities and make it practically impossible for them to be supplied. From there, they'll tighten the siege until they fall. These are the two tough nuts to crack, so to speak, in Donetsk. This is what's difficult. But as I said, the capture of Popasna and the future capture of Kupiansk will make it easier. In Kupiansk, which would be this advance coming from the southeast, more or less there in Kupiansk, let's see, there in...
Just a second. There's a small problem with the map. We're showing it again now, dear Fernando.
Bueno, pues la zona de Kupiansk.
Well, the area of Kupiansk, sorry, my mind's a mess. Konstantinivka. I keep mixing it up. This can't be. Konstantinivka, which is to the south. Well, what we're seeing there is a penetration from the east. Fighting is already taking place in that area, and a small part of Kupiansk has been taken. Damn, Kupiansk again! What an obsession! I mean, Konstantinivka. And there's a village called Ivanopilya. The Russians are assaulting that locality right now. And it's located, let's say, roughly above that reservoir that's already been taken. So, I mean, the whole reservoir area is under control. And once they take Ivanopilya, you can see it clearly marked there. where the soldier with the Ukrainian flag is. That's where they're attacking, and this is the last village, the last locality before reaching Konstantinivka.
Que antecede a Konstantinivka. Con lo cual, una vez que tomen esto, se plantan directamente ya en Konstantinivka.
So once they take this, they'll be right in Konstantinivka, on the outskirts of Konstantinivka, and they'll also start entering from this line, reinforcing the penetration coming from Predtekin and from, what's the name of this place? The one on the tongue, let's see. Well, there's hardly any settlement here, but anyway. But if you look at the map, you can see they've already entered Konstantinivka and that there's now a significant gray zone in the south. This would help, it would reinforce the attack, let's say from the south toward Konstantinivka, and then the subsequent advances that would come from Chasiv Yar, which is farther north, and advances from the reservoir area, but not from the right side, rather from the left, that is, from the west. And the idea basically is that, of course, once Konstantinivka is taken, there's only one major city left before reaching Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. This will take time. This is for next year. But once Konstantinivka is taken, the next advance is toward Drushkivka, which lies along that line. Ezekiel points it out perfectly on the map. And once they're in Drushkivka, only Sloviansk and Kramatorsk remain. Kramatorsk is farther down, more to the south. Sloviansk is farther north. This is what's being done. But as I said, this is for next year, right? That is to say, this isn't going to happen now in these 2 months, less than 2 months that remain. But as I said, fighting is already taking place in Konstantinivka, and progress will continue in the conquest of that city, which will fall. We can speculate whether it falls in January, February, or when, but it will fall. There's no saving it now. And then we already have, this is important, we can move on to Sanskove, the famous tongue the Russians created, the well-known attack that took them, no more and no less, to the road that connected Dobropilia with Kramatorsk, if I remember correctly.
Con Kramatorsk, si mal no recuerdo. Es decir, bueno, pues esta carretera, efectivamente con Kramatorsk, hicieron una...
Well, this road, indeed, with Kramatorsk, they made an advance, if you remember, at the beginning of August. The Russians reached this road, and from that point on, the Ukrainians panicked, and have since devoted themselves, at enormous cost because they've used a lot of units, to undoing, conquering, and reconquering this salient the Russians had created. And now the salient no longer exists. That is, they're here in Sakov, which is a very important city the Russians haven't been able to take, and they've been undoing this salient. But of course you might say, well, it makes sense given the danger it posed, but it has cost them a huge number of troops and units to eliminate the territories the Russians had conquered.
Eliminando los territorios conquistados por los rusos, enorme. Entonces, teniendo en cuenta que abajo está Pokrovsk.
So considering that Pokrovsk is down there, well, I don't know to what extent this was really worth it for them. Why? Well, why? Because in the end, they're going to capture Pokrovsk. And even if they've retaken this area, once the Russians take Pokrovsk, they'll advance to this road with relative ease. So, let's not forget, once Pokrovsk is taken, a bunch of units, thousands of soldiers who are currently encircling Pokrovsk, will move on to something else.
Miles de soldados que están en el cerco de Pokrovsk se van a dedicar a otra cosa. Quiero decir, esto ya se ha tomado, van a avanzar y van a avanzar.
That is to say, this area has already been taken. They're going to advance, and they're going to advance northward, as I said. A push to the north to get into the rear, as we saw earlier, of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And another advance to the west, because let's not forget they already have control logistically of the key highways. The E50, the capture of Udashne, which was crucial and very costly, which connects them to the T-046. All the roads that were essential for Ukrainian logistics will now be used by the Russians for their advance toward Dnipropetrovsk, which will also be significant. In this case, an advance toward a less important logistical center, but still a key one because it has roads to the north, south, east, and west, Mezova.
Tiene carreteras al norte, al sur, al este y al oeste, que es Mezova. Efectivamente, ahí lo señalas perfectamente hacia Mezova.
Exactly, you pointed out perfectly there, toward Meshova. This town, as you can see, has roads going in all directions, but since they're already taking Pokrovsk and have captured the T-046, they have a road to advance quickly toward Meshova. So these advances are going to be quite fast. As I said, once Pokrovsk is taken and things are settled, preparations are made for that advance. Because, as we can already see here, we've talked about it many times, they're now trying to quickly build trenches and so on. But that's not something you can do in 2 days.
That is to say, you can dig yourself a trench right now, make a trench. Fernando Moragón. In the midst of this desperate situation, and with a pocket in Pokrovsk on the verge of closing, toured the area, supposedly accompanying the troops and handing out medals and military honors, supposedly in Pokrovsk. This is the
It's General Silvio.
In a bunker, apparently. Here's the delivery. This is supposedly in Pokrovsk, according to CLNG's press team. Once again, right? The importance for them of the media aspect in the context of a war, a proxy war, a war by delegation, isn't it?
Of course, what happens is that if you look at some of the symbols the soldiers are wearing, yes, I've seen around, dear Lord, on all those symbols that terrifying one. Indeed, I don't know if people noticed or not, and in fact, there's even a photo where you can see a flag from an SS regiment from World War II.
That little eagle, that flag with an eagle. Well, this, for people my age, maybe not for others, is taken from the Silverhawks, definitely a cartoon from the 80s when I was a kid. The logo is exactly the same as the Silverhawks, but well, that's just kind of funny. Now let's see one thing here. The patches, all with the Totenkopf, as they call it in German, that Nazi skull, from the SS basically. A rune, yes, each one worse than the other, each one more Nazi than the other. Well,
sure, but one thing has to be said. We who are Trekkies, that is Star Trek fans, joke that when Trump created the Space Force during his first term, meaning rockets and all that, he separated it and made it a distinct branch. Right now, the United States has the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Space Force. Well, they had to create a shield, a symbol, and all that, but it's almost a carbon copy of Star Trek. It's hilarious. I mean, this isn't... Next time I'll show you both. We'll put them side by side because they're identical. Well, maybe Trump wants to build the United Federation of Planets? Who knows?
by the way, with that video of yours, Fernando, of the swarm of drones hovering, waiting for the soldiers,
it just has to be said.
An episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, just like that. A planet destroyed and taken over by automated weapon systems. At one point, the autonomous systems become independent, and Picard and his crew land on an empty planet full of these automated drones, and it almost causes the death of the entire team. Obviously not, because otherwise the series would end. But the images are the same. Of course, that's in the mind of, the director of Star Trek, Fernando, the name of the creator. It's Roddenberry, but he died a long time ago. This is something from the 80s. He helped with the concept, right? Yes.
The original series is his, as well as the first movies and all that. But look, it's incredible. Look, right now in Prokhorov, I'm seeing it here on the map. They've even advanced to a city that connects Prokhorov with Milnograd, called Rivne. The Russians are already there, pushing hard. But you can see that the current distance of that bottleneck between the Russian positions north of Prokhorov and the Russian advance from the north of Prokhorov must now be, from what I've last seen, less than 2 kilometers.
Here it is, Fernando. This is the logo of the Silverhawks, a cartoon from my childhood. Attention, the eagle is taken by our comrades here, back there, over here.
You can see it there. You can see it there.
Come on, very similar.
Copyrights. Let's see, if I were the creator of the map, well, there we can see how narrow it is. As I said, less than 2 kilometers. That's the bottleneck for the troops in Milnograd, because Prokhorov is already conquered. Some say, well, no, it's 90% conquered. Well, that's basically the same as 100%. In fact, what we already know is that not only the forward units, but almost everything, though I think it's still being consolidated. I mean, troops are already settling in, let's say, not regular attack forces, and they're proceeding with the cleanup and so on. So, they're already establishing themselves without major problems, given that there's no longer a coherent Ukrainian army in that pocket. There we have it. Well, just imagine, they've reached the little red flag on the map I have, and on the other side, if you go from the red flag up to the northernmost part, in gray, where the Russians are, you'll see what that means. In other words, what I've read is that they were less than 2 kilometers away.
A little less than 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers? If this is really taken by the Russians... Yeah, I've got this marked in red on...
In Suryak map, I never remember how it goes. He's conservative, meaning he's not the kind of guy who just jumps in. No, he reviews it and all that.
These images look kind of small there, but this map from Suryak, I'll show it a bit larger now. Fernando.
Look, see, this is a bottleneck, but a really big one.
Alright, here's the other map mentioned by Fernando Moragón, from Suryak. By the way, also quite conservative, quite neutral.
Yes, that's why I'm saying he's not the kind of guy who suddenly says, oh, I heard they conquered this. No. Look at what's left of the bottleneck. I mean, nothing. Just a small strip of land that's almost impossible to get out of. Look, as I said, less than 2 kilometers. That's what they're saying. Impossible. It's a complete encirclement. Through there, not even individually, at night, under the best conditions, the drones will let you through. I mean, you'd have to be very lucky to get out of there. And right now what we have is a situation of total chaos among the units. An attempt to retreat, but of course there's no other option left. Here either you surrender, as we've already seen, or you get killed. One of two things. You can't get out of this anymore. I mean, maybe an individual soldier, if he's very lucky, might make it through. But like this, well, this is exactly what needs to be avoided. We still don't know because the numbers keep changing. I've heard all sorts of things about how many people are trapped here. We don't know, right? Some say a few hundred, like 600 or so. Others even say 10,000, which seems crazy to me. I don't think there are 10,000 stuck here, but 1,000 or so. We just don't know. I mean, you're going to lose units for no reason. You can't really get out through here anymore. Besides the vehicles they have, artillery, whatever, it's all going to stay there, and this is a disaster.
An
avoidable disaster. Because even if you're at a disadvantage, as we said before, in manpower, weaponry, and so on, well, you can always fall back and move to a better defensive position. Because, well, Prokhorov held out for a long time, as long as it was possible. But there comes a point when it's no longer possible, due to the Russian superiority in weapons and manpower. And in capability, because the Russians have air power, and the Ukrainians practically don't. They have some F-16s that they use occasionally to drop a bomb or launch a missile, but not much more. So, well, ending up like this, a disaster. The criticism against Sersky and the generals from the soldiers has been enormous. In Ukrainian media, there are more and more criticisms from soldiers who write and say that this is a disaster, that the commanders are cowards, that they ran away when they could and left them behind, and things like that. Well, another problem the Ukrainian army has, which the Russian army also has, although it has been decreasing and comes from the Soviet era, is that you can't give bad information or bad news to your superior. So in the end, what you do is create a lie. You say, no, what's happening in your sector of the front? No, it's going well. Oh, the Russians haven't taken anything? No. They have taken it, but since you can't give bad news, you make it up.
This is creating. In the West, Fernando, the problem with bad news is different. You'll remember the sequence seen across the entire front over the 3 years of war. First, the Ukrainians make advances. They wanted to spend their holidays on the Crimean coast. Then, well, we're not making progress, but neither are the Russians. Then, oh well, the situation seems stalled. And after a while, yes, we're retreating a bit, but with heavy Russian losses. And finally, when Russia conquers everything, oh no, but that place has no strategic importance. The same thing happens when that place falls. Bakhmut, Mariupol. There's this pattern of readjusting the narrative. Exactly.
Well, and you could even add one more. Well, we've lost it, but we'll take it up again in the future.
Exactly. Well, the news here is that Pokrovsk, with no strategic relevance, this gentleman, Richard Shiref, something like that, former Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO's allied forces in Europe. Very neutral. British, obviously. Explaining, as always, in his very phlegmatic manner, the irrelevance of Pokrovsk. Pay attention.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me here. The Russian effort in Pokrovsk has been underway for more than a year and has resulted in the expansion of large numbers of Russians.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. This gentleman begins by saying,
The Russians have been fighting here for more than a year, and it has cost them enormous losses in human lives.
It has taken them eons to get where they've got to.
And the progress has literally been at a snail's pace, or rather, like a slug. It's taken them years to conquer these territories.
Why are they so focused on it?
Why are they so focused on it? Because it's there, because they've invested a great deal of effort in doing it. And this is a classic case of, in a sense, reaffirming rather than reframing the maneuver.
Rather than reinforcing maneuver.
And why, by the way, are they taking it? Well, because they've invested so many resources that they can't abandon it. And because, quite simply, that city is right there in front of them.
A pretty substantial Ukrainian brick wall.
It's a typical case of banging one's head over and over against a wall of Ukrainian defensive bricks.
Except for a Pyrrhic victory and some smoking.
And by the way, when they take it, after so many attempts, without the slightest sense, it will hardly give them any benefit from a strategic point of view. It will have no relevance for them. And the journalist replies, this is on Deutsche Welle, obviously Deutsche Welle in English, without much knowledge. But the Ukrainians are also losing many units. They're sending a lot of defenses. Obviously, the Ukrainians don't want to lose this city. From a place of ignorance, but with quite a bit of journalistic sense, she says, well, it's obvious. But this man, this master of dialectical contortionism, is going to respond with something phenomenal. Pay attention.
Well, clearly, Ukraine would.
Well, of course, the Ukrainians would rather not lose this place. But at the end of the day,
a bit, you have to take a bit. And of course, Ukraine has been moving forward as well.
But to gain territory, you also have to lose territory, and the Ukrainians have been making a lot of progress elsewhere.
Where?
So it's not, the Russians have not all had it all their own, making it extremely difficult for the Russians. So it's not over yet.
That's why the Ukrainians haven't lost everything yet. The Russians made a great effort to take this, therefore, things aren't over yet. To be continued. Fernando, yours, the one from just now.
Yes, it's just insane. Look, I understand that this man, who's a former NATO commander, that is a British military officer and all that, well, he has to play the role he's supposed to play. Because there are two hypotheses here, or two possibilities. One, that the guy has to defend the indefensible because of who he is. I mean, after all, he has to defend NATO and the United Kingdom. He's a former soldier, but as a former soldier, he's still very connected. And besides, that's what they bring him in for. I mean, well, the other, which would be the serious one, is that he actually believes it. I don't think he does, because if he does, we've got a serious problem in the West because we're in the hands of ex-generals. Well, generals. This one's a general. But anyway, from a school of thought, of European and British generals in this case, who would be out of their minds. I mean, my goodness, what a mess, right? I suppose this man has to play the role he's supposed to play. And that's why he has these contradictions and says such absurd things, like when even the journalist herself says, but come on, if it's not important, if this Procross place is just some spot lost out in the countryside that leads nowhere, then why have the Ukrainians been defending it tooth and nail for months, losing half their army there? Well, no. Well, yes, but come on. Man, no. Of course the Ukrainians wouldn't want to lose it. It's Ukrainian, after all. But these things are so obvious that even someone who doesn't know much can tell he's lying through his teeth. That is to say, and then, well, in the end this... No, well, but let's throw out a lie. In the end, it's all about telling half-truths, some really big lies, along with a few truths. So you mix it all together, make a jumble of it, and put it out there. That is, you say, no, well, but they're making progress in other places. Well, yes, what I told you is true. They did reconquer that part, but you'll always find, in quotes, advances, because there are always Ukrainian counterattacks in different parts of the front that are later lost. Well, yes, there's a counterattack where you capture a town, and then the Russians, after a short time, are going to take it back. But, well, yes. Still, this is delusional and pure propaganda. But of course, the problem isn't that this man says these things. Well, he's just doing the job he's supposed to do. The thing is, they all say it. I mean, all the Western media have experts like this man who tell you these things. And what's the problem? It's not just one person telling you this, they all are. And on top of that, they all tell you more or less the same thing, following the same script, right? It's like the talking points of political parties. You know, when there are elections, the major parties hand out a document that says, look, you have to talk about this topic, this one, and this one. If they say this to you, you have to respond with that. Well, that's it. This guy got NATO's talking points, saying, look, you have to say that the Ukrainians are winning, that the Russians are losing lots of men, that the Ukrainians aren't losing anything. Basically, the Ukrainians have lost nothing. 3 people. I mean, with these tactics of letting yourself get encircled, in the end, you lose a ton of people. But come on, it's so absurd that you say, let's see, obviously the Russians, even though they're very conservative about not losing troops, are attacking. Everyone knows that the side on the offensive usually has higher losses than the one defending, except in special circumstances. Even so, what we're seeing is that the Russian casualties, not deaths, meaning there are a lot of wounded, are being recovered quite well. That is, the number of wounded who can be evacuated from the battlefield and later returned to the front is high. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are having many more problems, among other things, because they're being abandoned.
Mientras que los ucranianos tienen muchos más problemas, entre otras cosas, porque los abandonan. Los dejan tirados a sus propios soldados, la mayoría de las veces.
They leave them behind, their own soldiers, most of the time. That's why when we go, practically every month there's one or sometimes two. When the exchange of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers' bodies takes place, we're seeing 1,000 Ukrainians for 57 Russians. Well, that's why. Because they're wasting their troops in a disgraceful way. Anyway, they're not going to tell you that. They have another narrative. They have to tell you that the Ukrainians are winning. And if they're not winning, they can win in the future. I don't know, in a century too, who knows. But they'll win. Well, it really makes me laugh. I mean, these people... Well, you have to understand that this man is a propagandist.
Esta gente, bueno, pues hay que entender que este señor es un propagandista. Entonces, pues, a ver, tiene mucho mérito.
Look, it takes a lot of nerve to go on television and spew such a huge string of lies. I mean, not laughing, I don't know. I mean, you have to have very little shame, right? Because in the end, this is going to be discrediting. The thing is, well, since news gets consumed so quickly, no one will remember this guy in the end. But it's still discrediting. I mean, if someone ever brings up the video a year, 2, 3 years from now, hey, were you really saying those outrageous things? But that's how it is, right? That's the problem. This is what all the major Western media outlets here in Europe tell us about this man.
Well, in Latin America.
In America, too. Well, there, you who are in Argentina, it's the same. The major media outlets, for example, in Argentina, tell the same story that more or less this gentleman tells us.
Obviously, yes. It's just that the war in Ukraine feels very distant. But here the narrative is, the United States, the only world power, the only salvation for Latin America, a submissive, obsequious, and servile attitude like Milei's, and everyone together with Daddy United States. That's the narrative in practically all the media. Despite the evident decline, the mortal decay of the United States, and its situation practically on the brink of a civil war. By the way, I came across Mondani's victory in New York yesterday. But speaking of the United States, Fernando, this is even more important. Let's go. These are the images, the last ones released by the United States 5 years ago, in 2020 if I remember correctly, of a test of a Minuteman III nuclear missile, without a nuclear warhead, of course. And today, the Americans, the US Armed Forces, announced a new test of this missile, also without a nuclear warhead. According to the Armed Forces, it's a missile from the 1970s, tested in the context of Trump's back and forth about, we're going to restart nuclear testing with warheads, unlike this one, which was without a nuclear warhead. All of this stems from fear, from the desperation that arose after the tests of the Burevestnik missile, which has a nuclear reactor but no nuclear warhead in the test, and the Poseidon torpedo, also with a nuclear reactor but no warhead in the test. Obviously, Trump heard the word nuclear and then responded, then we'll start nuclear testing right away. And this has consequences, because it's no joke. Putin then called the what do they call that group, made up of his main advisors? The Security Council, if I remember correctly. The Security Council, indeed. And he brought up this issue. By the way, this video was translated and presented courtesy of our friends at Wars and Geopolitics, our sister channel on Telegram. Don't miss it. It's one of the best sources for geopolitical information in Spanish. This happened today. We're presenting it here.
Can I ask you something? What? Can I ask you something? Can I ask you something?
Есть подвижность, поэтому вот исходя из того, что 2 года назад вы в своей стране сказали, что если США вернется к испытанию ядерного...
If the United States returns to the arms race, then Russia, for its part, has the right to do the same. May I, on this issue that concerns almost all the deputies, and these are their questions, explain what steps and activities we will take on our side? Because the issue is truly very important, and moreover,
Тема действительно крайне важная, тем более, что президент Соединенных Штатов Америки по ней высказался.
the President of the United States of America spoke about it. Yes, it's a serious issue. Let's listen to the words of the Minister of Defense.
Министру обороны Андрею Романовичу, пожалуйста.
Andrei Romanovich, please.
Вашингтоном стратегических наступательных вооружений.
Bueno,
Well, I shared this today. In the translation, at times it used the informal tu, and at other times the formal usted. If any expert familiar with Russian would like to, out of curiosity, determine whether Russians in these situations use a tu or vos form in.
Un trato de tú o de vos, alternativamente, o de usted.
Alternatively, or usted, because at least in Germany the use of tu in a matter like this is unthinkable. Everything is Mr. Putin, sir. No. Here I think it's usted. I mean, even with my buddies, that is, we're more formal in front of the cameras because this carries a certain significance.
Yeah, well, but Americans, Fernando, at least they know the opposite of this. Hey, Pete. Hey, Donald. Of course.
Yes, this thing about... Yes, exactly. I mean, Donald Trump was addressing the, let's see, in the context and all that, Pete, I don't know what. But no, these people are much more serious and formal, and in this kind of situation, it would never even occur to them. On top of that, on television in front of everyone and all that, if you see yourself all casual while presiding over Putin, well, according to you, the one who spoke first is Vyacheslav Volodin, the president of the Duma, the Russian parliament, and as president, he's part of the Security Council. I know him personally. He gave me a medal, years ago, because at a Congress, the usual thing, they invited me and all that. He was at the gala dinner they give for the guests, and I took a picture with him. Let's see, I exchanged 3 words through a translator because otherwise I wouldn't understand anything. And I took the photo, kind of the photo op and all that, and well, I'm with the president of the Duma. But beyond that, it's just for show, so we understand each other. Anyway, this heavyweight Volodin is more or less saying, in a very subtle way, that the deputies want a hard line. He doesn't say it like that, of course, very diplomatic and all, but that they're very concerned and so on. But it's true that what we're seeing, that's why you see, the deputies can also afford to make statements knowing they're not the ones making the decisions, meaning they can be tougher. Someone came out saying, we should just send a few Oreshniks, just like that, to the Westerners, so they get the message. Those deputies, as I said, well, it doesn't depend on them, so they can afford to say these things in public. But there is a concern about the following, because this, as always, is an attempt by the United States to put pressure on Russia and also on China. That is, by conducting a nuclear missile test ahead of the famous negotiations that haven't started yet but are supposedly going to happen about renewing or not renewing New START. So, what we have now is the following. The New START is a treaty, the last major treaty remaining, covering both nuclear and conventional weapons. Since 2001, the Americans have been withdrawing from one treaty after another, and the last one left is the most important. It's the treaty that regulates the number of nuclear warheads and missiles that both Russia and the United States must have as part of a disarmament process that dates back, in this case, to the Obama era. Well, this has resulted in both sides having roughly 1,600 nuclear warheads. Keep in mind, this marks the end of a nuclear arms reduction process. Yes, a nuclear arms reduction process.
Deployed nuclear weapons. Deployed, yes, yes.
They have more in storage. Deployed, fewer. They have more stored and so on. But well, in different situations. Some are ready to operate very quickly, and others would take longer. That is, it depends on the agreements, but there are fewer deployed. Mind you, at the height of the Cold War, late 70s, early 80s, around then, they each had about 30,000 warheads. 30,000, enough to destroy the Earth many times over. Well, despite Trump's boasting, which he's kept repeating in videos and so on, no, we're the biggest nuclear power in the world, and we have I don't know how many, whatever, nuclear weapons, and we have more than anyone, and the best ones. All that is Trump's nonsense that he has to say, but in fact, it's just the opposite. Right now, the United States is at a disadvantage. Why? Because although the quantity is regulated by the treaty, the quality is not. In other words, the treaty says nothing about whether your nuclear warhead or your delivery system, which also has a regulated number of vectors, meaning rockets, launchers, etc., are better or worse. That's not covered. And at this moment, although there is relative parity in numbers, the Russians surpass the Americans in quality by a wide margin. They have, as we've seen, a very outdated nuclear triad. The Minuteman missiles are a design from the 1960s, 1962, I believe. That is to say, this has been seen before. The launch that just happened. These are normal. I mean, both the Russians and the Americans occasionally carry out missile launches without nuclear warheads. They notify each other to avoid misunderstandings, and this, well, is part of the tests and trials conducted to assess each country's nuclear capabilities. Up to that point, this one may have been scheduled long in advance, or they may have sped it up. We don't know. But above all, regarding the announcement that we're going to conduct nuclear tests, there are several things that need to be said here. First, it's an attempt to pressure the Russians, and as I said, also the Chinese, because Trump wants to negotiate a possible agreement with both the Russians and the Chinese. That is, the Chinese say no. We'll discuss that later. But it's an attempt to pressure, let's say, the Russians. The Russians have already said, even before the Security Council met, that if the United States conducts nuclear tests, they will respond with nuclear tests. In fact, Putin has given the order in this Security Council to make the necessary preparations. It had already been said before, and they've reiterated it, let's say, the necessary preparations so that a nuclear test could be carried out in a very short time. In fact, they've been making those preparations for some time now, and I think everything is practically ready, all set, so that when Putin gives the order, a nuclear test will be carried out in Novaya Zemlya. That is, on an Arctic island, where quite a few nuclear tests have been conducted. What about the Americans? There's been a lot of commotion and criticism. Well, let's see, we have to keep one thing in mind. Both the Russians and the Americans haven't conducted a nuclear test since the 1990s because they signed an agreement banning nuclear tests and so on. They all had simulators, so they've been running tests on simulators, but not real ones. It's been the last one, I don't remember. I don't remember who it was. Well, the last ones were the French.
And these are 92, no, but these...
Number 92.
The 1996 agreement and France's test at the Mururoa Atoll. Mururoa or something like that, yes. Yes, a few years later, not much more.
Let's go, yeah.
They were the last ones, because everyone was criticizing them, saying, but now this and that. Then the North Koreans. But well, that's a different matter altogether.
Yes, but that's already on its own, meaning it's going in a different direction. So of course now, unless they've done a lot of preparation, which doesn't seem to be the case. This idea that more than 30 years have passed since a nuclear test was conducted. Right now, there aren't really the conditions to say, okay, next week we'll carry out a nuclear test. No. It doesn't work like that. You have to go to wherever they decide to conduct the nuclear test. The Mojave Desert, wherever, I have no idea. That is, you have to prepare all the systems, because this isn't just a matter of dropping a bomb and that's it. Prepare all the systems to make precise measurements of the effect it causes, whether it works well or poorly. In other words, a lot of things that can't be improvised and haven't been done for more than 30 years. That is, there are probably almost no engineers or nuclear specialists left who used to work on this, because they're retired. It's true. It may sound silly, but that's how it is. In fact, to give an example, we all know the Saturn V, the famous rocket that took the Apollo spacecraft to the moon. Well, if we wanted to build a Saturn V exactly as it was now, there would be problems, because none of the people who worked on the Saturn project are still alive. And the blueprints, well, they'd have to be found in the archives, and so on. I mean, it's not that easy. I don't think the United States is in a position, unless they had some secret preparations or something, to carry out a nuclear test anytime soon. I mean, anytime soon, meaning several months at least. That is, even if Trump says so now. I mean, unless they've been hiding some work or something, which I don't think, because with the change to the Biden administration, they were focused on other things. So I don't think Trump has had time, in the roughly 10 months he's been in office, to do that kind of thing. This stuff takes time. That is to say, well, for the moment, it's more of a wish than a reality, because even if the order were given tomorrow, this couldn't be done. I mean, look, the worrying thing is that the Americans, with their usual superiority and arrogance, are putting on pressure and haven't said anything, meaning they haven't said yes or no to the Russians' offer. The Russians have made a very reasonable offer. Look, this is the last remaining treaty. This is a disaster. If it isn't renewed, it's a disaster. Let's extend it for one more year to keep negotiating. And the Americans, Trump still hasn't said yes or no, because they've been using this kind of thing as leverage.
Yes, some fresh statements from Trump, but the kind he just throws out there for no reason. We're number one, but I'm working on a plan for the denuclearization of the 3 major nuclear powers. Well, just like he tossed out that thing about nuclear tests a week ago, now he's throwing this out, whether seriously or not.
Let's see, this is Trump's strategy, but it was also his strategy during his first term. The thing is, there really is a difference here between the Democrats and the Republicans, or at least the Trumpists. Trump refused to renew the New START treaty, to extend it. And he said he wouldn't enter into negotiations unless they were 3-way talks, unless the Chinese were included. The Chinese said no way, that at that time they had only about 300 nuclear warheads, and that they weren't a major nuclear power like Russia and the United States. I remember a very good response from the spokesperson, I think it was the foreign ministry spokesperson at the time, who said, and this is what they're doing. Look, it's not that we don't want to negotiate on this kind of disarmament issue, but of course we're starting from very different initial positions.
It's not the same to have 1,600 as to have 350, of which only some are operational. In total, the United States has about 5,000, and Russia about 2,500.
Indeed.
Here are the words from just now, Fernando.
This was a few minutes ago. From the Department of Defense to the Department of War. What kind of way of speaking does this guy have?
We changed the name from the Department of Defense to the Department of War. The way he talks.
And well, if you think about it,
People applauding.
or they change it to defense, right? So we won the first.
If you think about it, after World War II, it was changed to the Department of Defense. But we won World War I. We won World War II. We won all the wars in between and all the wars before.
We still don't lose wars. Sometimes we don't fight to win.
Sometimes we don't fight to win, you know?
We still don't lose wars. It's just that sometimes we don't fight to win.
We'll stay around the country for 15 years, just bomb the hell out of everybody, make every.
We just spend 15 years around a country, bomb everything, destroy everything. We make everyone miserable.
Nobody knows why we're there, you know?
Nobody knows why we're there, you know? Wars never end.
We don't know why we're going. Wars that never end.
But we made it clear that the days of political correctness in our military, they're over. We don't want to.
But we made it clear that the days of political correctness in our armed forces are over.
We built the military. We have the strongest military by far in the world. We make the best equipment, the best.
We're not going to fight any more wars, but I rebuilt our military forces. We're number one, the strongest. We have the best soldiers, the best weapons, the best missiles, the best rockets, the best of everything. We're the number one nuclear power, though I hate to say it.
So horrible. It's such a horrible situation.
Because it's a horrible situation.
Russia is second, China is third. I've said this 1,000 times already, even if it's politically incorrect. But oh well. The Chinese will catch up with us in 4 or 5 years.
Catch us, and they'll be able to catch us, and we're maybe working on.
And we're working on a plan to denuclearize ourselves, the 3 major powers, the 3 of us. We'll see how it goes, but we have the military, by far the strongest armed forces.
The United States Armed Forces this year is the biggest amount we've ever invested.
And we're going to invest $1 trillion, that's what they call it. In Spanish, $1 billion this year, the largest amount ever invested. Well, this is that. What a strange thing, Fernando. The mix of this comedian's humor with the handling of nuclear issues, right?
It's like, no. Yeah, well, look, if we didn't know that this man is Donald Trump and that he's the President of the United States, and someone introduced him to us for the first time, we'd think this is a show, a comedy show. I mean, but that's just how this man is. I mean, let's not forget that even though people say he was a successful businessman and all that, nothing. Successful businessman. 0. I mean, he had a bunch of bankruptcies.
We win all the wars. Well, we win some of them, but we don't win them because we don't want to. Yeah, that's it. Same thing.
Killing people and all that. But anyway, I mean, these are just trolls. If we didn't see Trump and didn't know it was Trump, we'd think he was a comedian. A comedian doing, because, well, this is what it is. This is the level of Western politicians. It's what we've got.
All right, but there's one thing. Okay, quickly. Eduardo is about to start, please.
Very quick. Very quick. What I was going to say, he brought up the thing about the Chinese again. That is, the key point is that he wants the Chinese to enter a disarmament process. The Chinese, knowing that with the Republicans, with Trump specifically, they were going to have problems, are now increasing their nuclear capacity, and it's believed they already have about 600 nuclear warheads, and that by 2030 they'll have around 1,000. And this is the key, the crux of it. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, you've forced the Chinese to have more nuclear warheads because you want to bring them into the disarmament process.
Indeed, well, to wrap things up. And by the way, this is our last broadcast from Buenos Aires. Tomorrow I'll be flying all day, and on Friday everything will be back to normal, with the return of Juan Antonio Aguilar after a long trip through Asia. And on Friday, well, you too, Fernando, after us. So that's it. Tomorrow the DMP geopolitics programs continue as usual, and now Eduardo Villor will start shortly on DMP. I wanted to end with something light-hearted, but also as a kind of reminder, a Russian military bakery, basically without music. This is military personnel dedicated to cooking, to preparing food for the people on the front lines.
A la preparación de alimentos para la gente en el frente. Esta es la panadería. Qué buena.
This is the bakery. How nice. That's very similar to a burek, huh? Yes, these are like little buns. Yes, this is also part of the war and the military effort. It's a burek, indeed. Burek originally comes from Turkey, but because of the Ottoman Empire, for example, on the last trip to Montenegro, in many places, many bakeries have burek. They're filled with different things, very tasty, and surely this has spread throughout Eastern Europe, so obviously in Russia as well.
And the sliced bread, let's say, is divided into white bread and black bread, because Russians really like black bread.
Well, this is part of the military effort too. That's why we wanted to present it. If you want armed forces in a war like this, all of this is necessary, isn't it?
Look, this is what we always talk about. The cooks who are cooking, the truck driver who's taking the road and bringing it to the front, the logistics. Most of your army is dedicated to that, not to shooting, to put it simply. That's the key. Whoever has better logistics is the one who wins.
Fernando, my dear, a pleasure as always. We'll be back together on Sunday, but on Friday before that, we'll be with Juan Antonio Aguilar, and you'll be on Friday on DMP Geopolitics with your own show, right? Exactly. DMP Geopolitics. Everything as usual. So this is my last broadcast from here, from my beloved Buenos Aires. The next one will be from Berlin.
I'd sing that song, My Beloved Buenos Aires, but without fear of it raining again, because this is awful, terrible. I mean, well, you know.
Hug, dear Fernando. All right, see you later.
Yeah.